Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Codi, Executive Director with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with practitioners, academics, and faith leaders to talk at the intersection of climate change, theology, faith, and justice. And this morning we have on a very good friend of GIPL and a friend of mine. I'm very excited. We have Mark Elliot, who is a storm specialist and meteorologist for the Weather Channel. Mark, thanks for joining us this morning.
Oh, glad to be here. I brought my logoed Weather Channel coffee mug and everything. I'm ready to go.
You're doing better than me. Well, to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work? We'll dive into it more later, but a little bit about what it is that you do.
Yeah, that's how much time we got, right? That could be the whole half hour or whatever. My work at the Weather Channel, I've been there for 17 years now, I guess it is. I started in 2004, and I'm now on the expert staff as a storm specialist role, which is basically talk about whatever could damage you or your life or your property that day, for lack of a better way to describe it. But really get into the nitty gritty science, make sure everyone understands what the risks are, keep people safe. That's our our mantra and our kind of guiding force is we're there to try to keep people safe, which is increasingly difficult these days with the amount of crazy weather that we have seen. Just as an example, even compared to last year, the number of people killed by flash floods this year in the US is almost double where we were for all of last year, and the year's not done yet. So it's been a tough year in that respect.
Well, we thank you for your work that you've done and in advance for the work that you will do. Mark, I think you have a reading to set the stage for us this morning, and so I'll ask you to offer that before we dive in.
Yeah, and so I've always kind of really taken to those intersections of where I'm Jewish, so where Judaism and my work with weather and climate kind of intersect. And there's two kind of short parables that I think work together. They're not necessarily meant to work together, but I always kind of join them because it frames a lot of what I think about when I'm doing this kind of work. And one, I'm going to really paraphrase it because it's from the Talmud, old school, way back there, but it's about an old man. They say about 100 years old. And he is doing really hard work, digging trenches in order to plant fig trees. And if you're not familiar with fig trees, they take a long time to go from like seedling all the way to when they're bearing fruit. So the story is a mean emperor of the area comes through and like stops the old man and says, "What in the world are you doing? Why are you planting fig trees? You will never see the fruit from these trees. You're already old." And there's, depending on which version of the parable you listen to, there's kind of two responses. One is, I had figs when I was young, and obviously I didn't plant them for myself. Someone else before me had to plant them, and so I'm planting these trees so that there will be figs later. The second answer is much more kind of personal. A personal answer is, well, if I don't live long enough to eat them, my kids and grandkids will be able to eat them. So same idea, but slightly different answer. Depending if it's for everyone or for that family, it still talks to the connectiveness that is needed for environmental causes, that it's not usually an immediate response. And the second parable that I think goes with this is taught by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And it's about a bunch of people that are on a boat. And one of the people that's on the boat takes out a drill and starts drilling a hole underneath his seat. And so obviously everyone else on the boat is like, "What the heck are you doing? Why are you drilling?" And the guy who's drilling goes, "What's it to you? I'm drilling underneath me. I'm not drilling underneath you. It's under my seat." And of course, it's a boat, and so if water comes in under one seat, it comes in to everyone. And water and the atmosphere, air and water, physically are exactly the same. all the same physical laws that control what water does also control what air does. So a lot of times when we're talking about really difficult topics to understand because air is clear and you can't see it moving and you can't see it spinning, we talk about water because you can see water going down a stream or water in a bathtub. It all works the same way as air. In this case, the boat is holding that space or that water. If the drill goes all the way through, is the same as our environment, it's the same as our atmosphere. It's a boat. There's only so much. And if somebody does something to that atmosphere somewhere else, it's still all of ours. It's all of our problems. So I like those two stories because it's about the time scale that's needed for environmental work and the interconnectedness between generations, between different areas of the world, between, all of this is connected and it is a global problem to tackle. It's not just one area that needs to work on it.
No, that's great. Thank you for that, Mark. I mean, with those stories, we've already kind of, we're getting into this topic. So I'll just ask, what the connections between your Jewish faith and how you practice that, how you think about it, intersects with kind of your professional life and concern about the weather. What is that like for you and what are those intersections?
Yeah, it's weird. I don't think I necessarily went into weather thinking I was going into, Jewish work, right? It's not like I'm at like Jewish Federation, right? It's not necessarily a Jewish title. But, as much as religion and science over time don't really get along, religion and morals really do have a long history of being intrinsically connected. And there's this moral connection to both weather and climate right now, that the people on the margins are affected by these weather disasters or climate disasters first and worse than everyone else, whether that's poor parts of the world or poor people within wealthy areas, whatever it is a justice story, this work. And so that helps frame what I do in a lot of ways. I also talk about how there's the classic from the Torah or from the Old Testament, depending on what you're used to reading, the "Am I my brother's keeper" story. And, when I'm on TV, I've said this, I don't know where everyone is, where they're watching, right? You can see me, I can't see you. It doesn't quite work that way yet through the cameras. We'll see over time if, the next 5D or whatever can show us what everyone's doing at the time. But so I don't know where you are, but I absolutely know where you shouldn't be. If there's a tornado coming, I know where you shouldn't be. And it's my job to try to get you into that safe place, whether it's a safer town, whether it's a safer part of your building, whether, whatever that safe place is. So that's kind of how I view it. I am my brother's keeper, and I don't know where you might be, but I know where you need to get to. And I try really hard to try to emphasize where those places are, where you need to be to stay safe.
Yeah, I love that tie-in. And we've talked about kind of the religious side. So then moving over to, just you as a meteorologist, when you think about climate change and, the effects that you've seen probably over your career, and then thinking about what comes next, what concerns you most when you're just doing your work and seeing the data come in? What is bubbling up for you?
Yeah, it's easy to be real dark about these things. There's not as much as there's a lot of hope and a lot of optimism, and the technology is changing faster than I think a lot of people thought it would. We're getting to that point where you don't want to, have hope as your best forecasting method and just hope that the technology gets there and saves us all from even more climate implications and climate disasters, because we're already seeing it. We're already living it. So what worries me is that we don't have whether it's the political will or the global will to take these bold actions that are needed, even as it's clear that the science is clear that this is happening and will get worse for climate disasters and then extreme weather within those. The science is clear that if we were to somehow get that investment change everything over, that it would have a huge return on investment, right? It would be a huge money driver. So the economics are clear, but finding that startup, as anyone that works in a nonprofit might know, or anyone that's trying to work in areas of just doing good, there's not always a lot of money flowing into it, even as there would be a return on that investment. It's a tough sell. And so that really worries me, that we're getting, the longer we go, the harder it is to fix or to stabilize, or however you want to frame it. The longer we go, the harder it will be. And the longer we go, the less return we get. And so the economic arguments become less attractive. It's just you're baked in to the bad at that point. So that worries me, that we're not moving fast enough. I mean, the UN chief, I can't remember his first name, but Guterres came out last week and basically said, well, the climate conference is happening now and it's going to fail. I was like, well, it hasn't even started yet. How are you saying that? Yeah. It's like, well, the rich companies the rich countries want to blame the poor countries, and the poor countries want to blame the rich countries. And then, so nobody's talking to each other, they're just blaming. And then the rich countries that have the ability to actually put money to it or start doing stuff are putting out these kind of pledges of money, pledges of time, pledges of action. They're all for like 2050 or 2075. And last I checked, it's only 2021, and we're already seeing more people dying from flash floods, slower hurricanes, more fires. Like,
we need to
it's happening now.
2030.
Do we want to wait till 2050, 2100? It doesn't seem like it's a fast enough scale. So that kind of stuff worries me, that we're not on it the way we should.
Yeah. Well, you lifted it to the international scale, and I know, every year this happens where an IPCC report comes out, and everyone is reading kind of the top lines of how bad it is, and we can't let it get to 2 degrees Celsius and all these things. And I wonder if you could just talk about, for the average person, what the IPCC report is, what is this 2 degrees about, and what actually does that report tell us right now?
Not a lot of good.
Yeah.
That's the easiest way to frame it. It is a very long report. They always are. They're always very complicated. They're in science speak, and they have these summaries that are a little bit easier to digest for the average person. And even they are kind of bold. So then you kind of rely on the UN summary of the summary, and they come out and say, things are really bad.
Yeah.
And so basically right now we're at roughly 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming already. So we're within that degree of the goal of limiting the warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less. That is done, that 2 degrees is put there because of a long duration of scientific studies that say that's really kind of the tipping point, that you start seeing much worse impacts if the Earth has an average temperature of 2 degrees Celsius more. They use Celsius because it's a global problem, and the US stands alone in using Fahrenheit. But I guess in some ways it is a disservice to those that aren't in the scientific world using things like Celsius, because it's small, right? 2 degrees C is what, 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit or so. And think about the world as a person. I know it's tough to personify it, but 5 degrees on a thermometer for your body temperature could kill you.
Yeah, the difference between 98 and 102 is a lot different.
Yes. And so, but also 98 Fahrenheit to 100 Fahrenheit as an adult is a big deal. And so if you frame it that way and you start thinking about, okay, an average temperature of a few degrees can really be noticeable and can be really destructive, then it kind of moves the needle a little bit more. But basically that is set because of the scientific literature that says we will have oceans rising much more to a much more noticeable point than they are already. We'll have much more flooding. We'll have much more drought around that flooding. We'll have more fires on that intersection. We'll have slower storms. We'll have, like, think about all the things you've heard about with regards to climate change and ramp it up a notch.
Yeah.
That's what really kicks in by that 2 degrees. Can we prevent it? Maybe, he says, not so optimistically.
Yeah.
Yes, the real answer is yes. We can stop from getting to 2 degrees, but it would take real action of limiting carbon dioxide emissions to near zero, and even starting drawdown, which means going negative, taking out taking out more than we put out. So starting to remove carbon from the atmosphere, whether that's by technology or by changing what we're doing with regards to planting more trees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's possible. It's just we're not on the path yet. And so again, going back to what worries me, we're not doing the things the scientists are saying are needed.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, I want to switch gears, but it doesn't feel right to do it without saying, what action, either on the federal level or on the state level, or, communities of faith, what steps get us on the right path? What do we need?
Yeah, and so, the Drawdown Project is a national and global project that has tons of information. So I'll never be able to get to all of it in this chat, but that's a link that we can forward to.
Definitely.
And if people happen to be watching from Georgia, where we are, we have a state version of Drawdown, the Georgia Drawdown Project, which is just an epic resource because it breaks down how we get on that path for this state in particular. And then for the global one, it's for, how does the whole world do it? And it breaks down what the main inputs are to the climate problem and what the outputs are to the climate problem. And there's really only 5 of them or so and it becomes a much easier problem when you think about it that way. Things like transportation, things like energy, things like building efficiencies. When you think of it in those big buckets, you have entry points. And so when you then go down to the personal level or the church or synagogue level, it's an attackable problem, right? You can incentivize in some way electric cars for your community by having electric vehicle charging at your parking lot. That makes it easier for people. You can put solar on these big building roofs, and that dramatically changes your energy use. These buildings are generally really, really, really old, and so their efficiency is terrible. Changing over some of the insulation or the windows, if possible. Not all of them are possible. I'll use my synagogue as an example. It's such an old building that the way they built the windows at the time, with these single pane frames of glass that leak out all of your heat and all of your AC, are structural. They are literally part of the wall. They're not like an insert window that can come out and put in a new window. You would have to lift the whole building, take out a wall, put a wall back, and fix the windows. It's a non-starter. So each individual building and home and person needs to find their modes of attacking this problem. But collectively, if we were all to do that, it's a huge benefit.
Absolutely.
And so again, it goes back to drilling on the boat. If we're all drilling, if one person's drilling, it's a problem. But if we're all working together to move in one direction, that boat starts flying.
Yeah.
And so that's very vague, right? Because I think it is very individual. But did it sort of answer the question?
It's not just hoping for the sake of hope. There's some things to do. We can hope while doing, and maybe that's a better way to frame it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that there's a lot of times people focus on the carbon sinks. Okay, we're going to, as a community, we're going to go plant trees, which is great. Or we are going to fix our front lawn so that it's more diverse and has more carbon capturing ability other than just grass that we cut every week,
right,
and then pay to cut, which is also great. But what happens when the trees you planted don't take, or a new developer comes in and that land is sold and it's suddenly a parking lot again? Those sinks are often as permanent as we wish all our trees are. A bad storm comes through and knocks them all over, which happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially in Atlanta.
Those sinks are not as permanent as we want them to be. And so my wish is that more people would focus on the sources, never get that carbon in the first place.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to worry about taking it back out. And so finding ways to limit the inputs. For example, food is such a big part of all of these, religious gatherings. You don't have a big religious gathering without lunch, right? It doesn't happen. These faith communities can really analyze what they're serving, the carbon inputs are and what they're serving, what they're teaching people by serving it, what it's being served on. Is it compostable? Can it go into a compost bin? Are you then composting and reusing that soil? Or is it plastic? Is it a huge input to the climate problem because it's made out of gasoline, for lack of a better term? It's made out of, dead dinosaurs. And then it stays on Earth forever and becomes part of the plastic problem, which is also tied to all of this. Or is it, a much more green look at how we eat and what we're eating? Those are all real changes that can stop the inputs before the carbon, or whatever, the methane in this case, for food input, before it gets there.
Yeah.
Are we ordering too much? Is it all going into the trash and becoming methane by going into a dump somewhere? It's not being composted on a small scale. It's going to a dump. It's totally oxygen free. It turns into methane, which is a far more powerful climate gas than carbon dioxide. And you wouldn't necessarily think about it because, we bought too much tuna that day and it all went in the trash. But that, without, eating it and using it and getting it to people that need it, or ordering the right amount in the first place, is a huge carbon input.
Yeah.
So there's ways to stop that part of the cycle as well. And I think that's where, faith communities can really get hands-on.
That's great. You mentioned earlier, your kind of role. You said, I know where you shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. And then also we were talking about the sort of drilling in the boat analogy about you kind of have to care about what's happening in other places and what other people are doing. And so when we think about the US, or we think about the world, we have hurricanes here in the Southeast, we've got wildfires in the West, we've got all sorts of things happening in the North. And, for you, why should people care about what's happening on the other side of the country when they're thinking about climate impacts? And, second half of that question, kind of the where you shouldn't be question, is really more about, even if we do our best and we put all these solutions in place where we're curbing our carbon and our emissions and we're getting things under control, there's still a need to invest in disaster preparedness, climate resilience, adaptation, maybe leaving certain parts of the country permanently because we know that those impacts are coming. And so I wonder if you could speak to those two things. Why should people care about what's going on in other places? And then kind of this adaptation piece.
Yeah, so for the first question of why should people care, in the short term, it immediately is affecting your wallet. Especially in the West, where so much of our food is from, so much of our vegetables are grown in California. Huge fires came right through the Central Valley over the past couple of years. It immediately affects your wallet. For those of you that like ocean-based food, whether that's shellfish or just normal fish, seafood of all kinds, there are studies that just came out over the past couple of weeks that say that seafood overall is shrinking. That because of less ideal environmental conditions, or maybe just different environmental conditions, there's more stress on these animals. And so their energy is not being placed in growing. And so then we are needing more of them to do the same amount of food that we needed in the past, which then goes into an overfishing story. So then there's a younger stock, which is then also smaller. And so this is this compounding feedback loop. The bottom line is that your salmon from the Pacific Northwest is much smaller than it used to be overall. Your lobster roll is much more expensive than it used to be. Not saying that everyone watching eats all of those things, but if generally, it's smaller, and that means you need more of it, and it's going to cost more. There's also more invasive species because of a change in the temperatures and small changes of ocean temperatures. Because the ocean is so big and it takes so long to change the temperature even a little bit, organisms there are really fine-tuned to their exact degree, and they're mobile more often than not. And so as those temperatures change, the fishing stocks are moving, and it's usually the invasive species moving into an area that take over, and sometimes take over faster than the original species can get out and go somewhere else. And so there's a story up off the Northeast coast right now where invasive clams I think it's clams. I'm not real up on my shellfish since I don't eat it, but I think it's invasive clams were moving in because of a slightly different water temperature, took over the area, and there was another, there's another mollusk of some kind that was eating what was there. They don't like the new kind, and so they're in big trouble. And again, so it affects your wallet. So that's one reason why you should care. In the longer term, it's because the impacts there affect all of us. If, there's much more emitting going on in the West Coast because of huge fires, that carbon dioxide doesn't stay over the West Coast. It doesn't just heat up there, it heats up everybody. And that similar why we need to care about China or India or the good work that's happening in Eastern Europe. You have to care about all of it. Because it is one boat. And so emissions or sinks affect all of us. It is a global problem, and we really need to work together, find ways that the rich and the poor countries can find some sort of common ground agreement, because it won't work otherwise. And just quickly, why there's so much disagreement on that. The poorer nations are saying, well, this is like, we're just getting into our industrial revolution. This is all the rich countries' problem. You guys did all this. It shouldn't be our job to fix it all, because we're just starting. And the rich countries are saying, well, you might just be starting, but there's so many of you now that are emitting that you're putting out way more now than we are. And so it's also your problem. And they're both right, and thus they're both wrong, and nobody's talking to each other. And then the second part of your question of where we should be, and I forgot part of it.
Well, so how we think about investments, so we do everything right, but we still need to now make investments in disaster preparedness, resilience. There's going to be some adaptation. Should we be leaving certain parts of the coast permanently?
Right.
I think about this a lot because we work with faith communities all across the state. There are faith communities on the coast, who have been there longer than we've been a country. And so the idea of thinking about abandoning those sacred places, I think is a real conversation, though, that has to take place.
Yeah. Nobody wants to say, hey, the home that you've known for your whole life, that your, generations and generations and generations of people connected to you in some way have lived, abandon it. Pick up, leave. It's easier said. We'll put it that way. But there are groups that are looking at that very thing. There have been lots of, federal government buying up properties in coastal Louisiana that just are, coastal Louisiana is both sinking and having water rise, and that combination is not sustainable. And so, we shouldn't have people that are then buying new homes there and then starting to live there. It just doesn't make any sense. And so the federal government is saying, we're going to buy that. We're going to turn that back over into marshland and own it.
Yeah.
the intersection of the faith community in, disaster response is such a crucial one, right? Even, in the FEMA infrastructure, it's clear that they rely on these local groups to step in after a weather/climate disaster. And I think it's not necessarily sustainable over the long term. The amount that is being placed onto these faith communities to step in and do that work of recovery and helping people get back on their feet. It's possible in the short term. I just don't know if it's possible in the long term for what may be needed. Just as an example, you look at what Hurricane Ida did this past, couple months ago, came into Louisiana, went all the way up into the Northeast with flash flooding all along the way. More people died in the Northeast from flooding than they did at the Gulf Coast from a hurricane coming in. And the, homes and businesses and, whole neighborhoods in New York City were underwater, and, people were living in these basement apartments that were unregulated, that were not supposed to be living in. And if you're not from that area, if you're not, I'm from New Jersey, I went to New York City a lot. Those basement apartments are kind of like storage areas, right? You open up that big metal grate, and then you walk down awkward stairs, and like it's underneath buildings and restaurants, and they often like keep their extra vegetables or their garbage cans or stuff down there. Well, some of those were over time were converted into apartments. But when it flooded as fast as it did, how do you get out of there? Right? That big metal grate is now underwater. It immediately is filling your place. You have no time to get out. And so that is a conversation that's happening. How do we make sure that people are safe? Whether that's the government, whether that's faith groups, I don't know. But there's obviously a need for, after a weather disaster, for these faith groups to step in. It's churches, it's synagogues that open up their doors and give people a place to go first, and then their community comes in with all the food and all, the portable grills, and they feed the whole community. But how long can they do that? That's just donation based. Like none of these places are rich. There's always a couple of exceptions. A mega church that's on TV every week might have a lot more money than a small community church, but most of these places don't have that kind of money, funding, time, volunteers. They're always asking for money, time, volunteers, right? It's constant. And so how do you then stretch that when these types of events are becoming more and more and more common? Sometimes, you look at Lake Charles last year, 3 hurricanes came through the same town. They're still recovering. Is it really the community church that's supposed to be a year and a little bit more, still feeding people, still housing people? Maybe, but it's not sustainable if it keeps on coming to the same areas.
The speed is something that strikes me, because, we talk about like response time, and we're talking about how to make congregations into a bit of resiliency hubs, or to be able to respond a little bit better. But in thinking about Ida, some of these hurricanes are now popping up so fast that there's actually not the lead time to do an appropriate evacuation. There's not the lead time to put in some of the structures in place, because it takes X amount of time to put that in. Yeah. And so we're going to see more and more, perhaps, of those people kind of trapped, or it kind of comes up out of nowhere and you don't have time to make adequate plans.
Yeah, the out of nowhere phrase is one of every meteorologist's pet peeves, because
out of nowhere
no
to
matter
me,
how
not out
much,
of nowhere to you.
Yeah, right. But it's a failure on our system, right? Because we're talking about it. We're obviously not talking about it well, or to the people that need to hear it. Ida was forecast to intensify, and for 2 or 3 days was forecast to rapidly intensify as it was approaching. And yet it wasn't received in a way where the right communities could issue evacuation orders on time enough for it to be safe for the people to then be on the road and leaving, because evacuations take a long time. Contraflow, setting up roadways that normally go this way, only go this way, takes a lot of doing, a lot of manpower, and a lot of time. And so those decisions needed to be called sooner. And it wasn't possible by the time they decided that, yeah, we probably should have done this.
Right.
And it was not safe to do. Rapid intensification is a known event that happens with tropical systems. Every major hurricane that's ever happened in the history of ever has gone through at least one rapid intensification cycle, which means it's a technical term, dropping 24 millibars in at least 24 hours. That's a measure of pressure. And the lower the pressure gets, generally the faster the wind speeds are. And so it's a proxy for how strong the storm will be. Most major hurricanes go through at least two, some more than that, of these phases of rapid changes and rapid strengthening. And so it's on us to just, have that be part of the forecast and have it be better understood. It's also part of the insurance infrastructure. So people let's say you have insurance, you're doing everything right, but that doesn't mean you're rich, and doesn't mean that you have the ability to pay for an evacuation, which means leaving your home, buying all your food on the road, finding a hotel room, paying for gasoline, all those things. Not everyone has that kind of immediate expendable income to do.
Yeah.
So
to be able to take off a couple of days to even plan to do that.
Not go to work a couple of days earlier than the storm is even there. Not everyone can do that. Insurance is supposed to reimburse you for an evacuation if and only if a mandatory evacuation was ordered in that area. But what happens when it's an IDA and that evacuation was never ordered, but you needed to leave and you did it on your own? Well, then you have to pay for it.
You're just on your own.
Right. But what if you stay because you don't have that money, and then you're putting your life in danger? Right. That balance, not good. That's not an easy equation. And it shouldn't be on a normal, everyday, American to have to figure that out. That should be on the weather community and the insurance community and the government communities to have a better understanding of that forecast and work better together to make it possible. The other side of that argument is you don't want a storm that's going to come through South Florida and then kind of get near the east coast of Florida and then come near the northern Gulf Coast states and kind of hang out for a couple of days where there might be many evacuations ordered, precautionary, and give everybody an excuse to drive to Miami Beach and have a 5-star hotel party. That's not going to make the insurance industry stay solvent. And if they leave an area because people abused it or whatever the case may be, then nobody has insurance, and the cost for everyone goes up exponentially because there's only one or two options left.
Right.
And so there's this balance of how do we make the insurance do what it's supposed to do and not have it be just totally overrun with claims to the point that they leave.
Yeah.
I don't have those answers. I'm just going to work on the forecast and hope that people smarter than me figure it out.
No, that's great. Mark, thank you. We're over, but I'm going to ask you one more question as we close out. I want to thank you for this. We are in Sukkot now, so it feels inappropriate to have this conversation without talking about that. So I just wanted to ask you if you would tell everybody a little bit about what that is, why it matters, and how it intersects with this work.
Yeah, Judaism is great for me because it has all of these environmental-based traditional holidays. In Judaism, there's Tu B'Shvat. There's a holiday for the tree. I mean, if that doesn't speak to what I've been talking about, what does, right? Yeah. Sukkot is a harvest holiday, and here I'll try to tilt my laptop here. Let's see. That is a sukkah in my backyard. It is a temporary structure that has to have at least 3 walls. It has a temporary roof that you're supposed to be able to see the stars through. And it's basically a celebration of the end of the harvest, the end of the growing season. It's one of the oldest festival holidays in Judaism. It goes back to, how people that were nomadic, hunter-gatherer farmers built these temporary tents and these temporary structures to be able to move to the next place where there was more food or more places to hunt or gather or farm. So this was the end of the farming holiday, and they built these structures. And during Sukkot, you're supposed to have it's a welcoming holiday. You're supposed to have visitors. You're supposed to have all your meals out in that temporary structure. You're supposed to sleep under the temporary structure like a camping holiday, right? It's an outdoor holiday, and it really, for me, brings me back to everything we've talked about. What happens when your growing season changes because your temperatures have climbed enough? What happens when there are no crops in an area because you flooded the fields because of a flash flood and it destroys the whole season? What does that do to the small scale farmer, the community that relies on that food, the global or the country's food security, the global cost of food? Like, there's all these layers that grow and grow and grow from these weather disasters, and it all speaks to this holiday Sukkot that's happening right now. It started today or last night, I think.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on Coffee and Something Stronger, and thank you so much for your work.
My pleasure. One little plug before we go.
Absolutely. Yes.
If people want to hear more about the work that the Weather Channel is doing in the climate space, there's a brand called Pattern, spelled without an E, Pattrn. You can find that on the Pattern website, on all the social media platforms as well. And it is a streaming channel on a lot of the ways you get your streaming video sources, which is all kinds of great content about all the things we've talked about today and more. And so people can really dive deep into the intersection of weather and climate on that platform. And it's something that is growing, and I'm proud of. So I wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely. And we'll post a link in the comments to this video, and you can find it there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark, thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thanks for having me.
See you next time. Bye-bye.